Imagine walking into a courtroom thinking you're about to lose everything. But in the next 15 seconds, the entire game flips. The judge thought he had the winning hand until the man standing before him revealed a card nobody saw coming. This isn't luck. This is justice dealt with a royal flush. Ladies and gentlemen, you won't believe what happened in this courtroom. It was a busy Tuesday morning inside a small-town courthouse. The atmosphere was tense, with people sitting shoulder to shoulder on the old wooden benches, waiting for their names to be called. Some whispered nervously, others tapped their feet anxiously, all under the watchful eye of Judge Richard Owens. For years, Judge Owens had built a reputation for being one of the toughest in the county. But behind his strictness was something uglier and arrogance, and a prejudice that many people felt but no one dared to challenge. That morning, the heavy courtroom doors opened and a young black man walked inside. His name was Marcus Johnson. He was tall, confident, and sharply dressed in a dark suit that made him stand out immediately. In his hand, he carried a neat leather folder, walking with calm steps as if he had nothing to fear. But the moment Judge Owens laid eyes on him, his expression shifted. His jaw tightened, his eyes narrowed, and his body leaned back in his chair with a dismissive air. It was as if he had already judged Marcus before a single word had been spoken. "Next case!" The judge barked, rolling his eyes. Marcus stepped forward. His case was simple on paper, a traffic violation. He had been accused of speeding on a highway at night, pulled over by an officer who treated him with disrespect and handed him a ticket. With a heavy fine, Marcus knew the accusation was false. He could have quietly paid the ticket and moved on, but he refused. Not because of the money, but because of the principle. He believed in the law, and he believed in justice. And he would not allow himself to be labeled guilty when he had done nothing wrong. What no one in that courtroom knew was that Marcus wasn't just another man fighting a traffic ticket. He was a highly respected federal prosecutor, a man who spent his days standing in courtrooms far larger than this one, prosecuting criminals and defending justice. But none of that mattered to Judge Owens. He didn't bother to ask, and he didn't care to know. All he saw was Marcus's skin-colored dot as Marcus stood tall before the bench. The judge sneered. "Another one of you trying to talk your way out of a ticket, huh?" His voice carried across the courtroom, and a few people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Marcus kept his composure. "Your Honor, with respect, I have evidence that clearly proves I wasn't speeding, but Judge..." Owens cut him off sharply. "Save it. I've seen this 100 times before. You people never want to admit when you're wrong, always an excuse. Always a story." The words struck like a slap. Gasps echoed quietly through the room. Some dropped their heads in embarrassment. Others stared wide-eyed, shocked that the judge would say such a thing aloud. Marcus didn't flinch. He opened his folder and calmly placed a set of documents on the desk. "Your Honor, the officer's radar reading was faulty. I have GPS data from my car, as well as dashcam footage, all of which prove I was driving below the speed limit." The judge didn't even glance at the papers. He scoffed and waved a hand dismissively. "I don't need to see it. You were caught, and that's the end of it. I'm fining you $500. Pay it or face further penalties." The room filled with whispers. Everyone could sense the injustice. The arrogance in the judge's voice was clear, but Marcus stayed calm. He had faced men like this before, men who thought their position gave them the right to ignore the truth. Taking a steady breath, Marcus spoke clearly. "Your Honor, I respect this court, but justice requires fairness. Evidence should always be considered. And right now, you are refusing to even look at mine." "Judge." Owens slammed his gavel, his face red with anger. "Watch your tone, young man. I am the authority in this courtroom." But Marcus didn't back down. Instead, he reached into his folder once more and pulled out a small card. He placed it gently on the bench so everyone could see. The courtroom fell silent. It was his official identification card from the United States Department of Justice. Marcus Johnson wasn't just a man fighting a ticket. He was a federal prosecutor, someone who had the power and responsibility to fight corruption and injustice across the nation. Gasps filled the room. The clerk leaned forward to look. The bailiff froze, and the people in the benches whispered in disbelief. Even Judge Owen's confident smirk disappeared in an instant. His hands trembled slightly as he picked up the card, reading it over and over as if he couldn't believe his eyes. You're a federal prosecutor? He asked him. Marcus nodded firmly. Yes, Your Honor. And part of my duty is to uphold the law, to make sure justice is served. What happened here today is deeply concerning. Not just for me, but for every person who comes before this bench expecting fairness. The judge sat frozen, his face pale. His arrogance had vanished, replaced by fear and shame. For years he had acted untouchable, but in that moment, in front of everyone, he had been exposed. The people in the courtroom would never forget what they witnessed. A judge who thought himself above the law was humbled by a man who truly understood it. And Marcus proved something powerful, that justice should never depend on race, appearance, or status. Justice must always be fair. That day Marcus walked out of the courtroom not as a defeated defendant, but as a symbol of integrity and courage. As Marcus approached, Judge Owen sneered. Another one of you trying to talk your way out of a ticket, huh? He said loudly, his voice dripping with sarcasm. A few people in the courtroom chuckled uncomfortably, unsure whether to laugh or stay silent. Marcus, however, didn't flinch. His posture was calm, his tone respectful. Your Honor, I have evidence that proves I wasn't speeding. But the judge didn't let him finish. With a wave of his hand, he cut him off sharply. Save it, I've seen this 100 times. Before, you people never take responsibility. You're guilty and you'll pay the fine. The words hung in the air like poison. The phrase, you people, echoed across the courtroom, heavy with meaning. Some gasped. Others looked down at the floor, embarrassed and ashamed for the judge's words. Even the clerk hesitated with her pen, clearly shaken by what had just been said, but Marcus didn't lose his cool. He had dealt with worse than arrogance. With quiet confidence, he opened his folder and placed a set of neatly prepared documents on the table. With respect, Your Honor, the officer's radar reading was faulty. I have GPS data from my car and dashcam footage that clearly shows I was driving under the speed limit. The judge didn't even glance at the evidence. He waved his hand, dismissively, as though Marcus's effort meant nothing. Enough. You're fined $500. Pay it or face further penalties. Whispers rippled through the courtroom. The arrogance was shocking. People shook their heads, whispering to one another, unable to believe how openly unfair the judge was being. But Marcus simply took a deep breath. He had been in bigger battles than this, and he knew something the judge didn't know. Judge Owens leaned back in his chair, smug and satisfied, as if the case was already over. To him, it was simple. Another young black man in his courtroom, trying to argue, trying to fight, and in the end, losing. But Marcus didn't move. He stood firm, his eyes fixed on the judge, his expression calm but steady. Your Honor, he said after a pause, justice requires fairness. I have provided evidence that proves I did not break the law. And yet, you refuse to even look at it. The judge slammed his gavel in irritation. Do not lecture me on justice. I decide. What happens here? You are guilty, and that's final. The room grew tense. People could feel the injustice thick in the air. A few shook their heads in disbelief. Others avoided eye contact, uncomfortable with the ugly truth they were witnessing. Marcus, however, wasn't done. Slowly, he reached back into his folder and pulled out something else. It wasn't more paperwork. It wasn't a video or a picture. It was a small identification card. He held it up for everyone to see before placing it firmly on the bench in front of the judge. The courtroom fell silent. The judge glanced at it casually, at first dismissive, but then his eyes widened. He leaned forward, squinting at the card, his lips moving as he read the words on it. His smug expression faded, replaced by confusion and then panic. The card bore the official seal of the United States Department of Justice. Marcus Johnson wasn't just a man fighting a traffic ticket. He was a federal prosecutor. Gasps echoed. Through the room, the clerk's pen slipped from her hand. The bailiff froze where he stood. People in the benches leaned forward, whispering in shock. This wasn't just another case anymore, this was something much bigger. Judge Owen's face drained of color. He stared at Marcus, his voice trembling slightly now. You're a federal prosecutor? Marcus nodded calmly. His voice was steady, controlled, but carried the weight of authority. Yes, Your Honor. And as a federal prosecutor, I fight every day to ensure that justice is served fairly. What I have seen here today, your refusal to even consider evidence, your bias, your comments, this is not justice. The judge swallowed hard, shifting uncomfortably in his chair. His arrogance had vanished. He suddenly seemed small, fragile, even frightened. Marcus continued, his voice echoing in the silent courtroom. If this is how you treat me, I can only imagine how many ordinary citizens walk through these doors and leave without ever receiving a fair chance. That is unacceptable. Murmurs filled the courtroom again, this time louder, stronger. People nodded, some even quietly clapping before quickly stopping themselves. The truth was undeniable. The judge's prejudice had been exposed for all to see. Judge Owens opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. He stammered, his face red with embarrassment. I didn't realize who you were. Marcus raised an eyebrow. That's exactly the problem, Your Honor. Justice should not depend on who a person is. It should not depend on their title, their status, or the color of their skin. Justice should be equal for everyone in every case. The room was utterly still. Everyone felt the weight of his words. The judge slumped back in his chair, defeated, his gavel hanging uselessly in his hand. For years he had sat in that courtroom, untouchable, untamed. But today, in front of everyone, he had been humbled. Marcus gathered his documents, picked up his ID, and stood tall. He didn't need to shout or threaten. The truth alone was enough to shake the courtroom to its core. As he walked toward the door, all eyes followed him. People whispered his name, realizing they had just witnessed something unforgettable. And Judge Owens? He sat silently on the bench, staring down at his desk. His career and his pride shattered in one single moment. Marcus proved that day that courage and integrity will always shine brighter than arrogance and prejudice. And he left behind a powerful reminder. True justice does not bow to power, bias, or fear. True justice stands for what is right, no matter what. After announcing the fine, Judge Owens leaned back smugly, tapping his gavel lightly as if the case was already closed. But Marcus didn't move. He didn't reach for his wallet, didn't bow his head, and didn't turn to leave. Instead, he stood tall, his gaze fixed on the judge. The room grew tense. People on the benches leaned forward, curious about why this man wasn't reacting the way so many others did when faced with the judge's harsh decisions. Then Marcus spoke, his voice firm but calm. Your Honor, I respect this court. But I will not accept an unjust ruling, especially one clouded by bias. The judge's smirk slipped. His face turned red as he leaned forward, glaring down from the bench. Bias? Are you accusing me of being unfair in my own courtroom? His voice boomed across the room, meant to intimidate, but Marcus didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice or show anger. Instead, he calmly reached into his folder, pulled out a small card, and placed it carefully on the bench where everyone could see it. The courtroom went silent. The card gleamed under the lights. Printed in bold, official lettering, it read, Federal Prosecutor, United States Department of Justice. Gasps filled the room. The sound of surprise rippled through the benches. The clerk leaned forward in shock, her eyes widening as she read the words. The bailiff stiffened, suddenly unsure of what to do. Ordinary citizens sitting in the back exchanged glances, whispering in disbelief. Judge Owens froze. The confident smirk that had never left his face until now was gone completely. His hands trembled slightly as he reached out and picked up the ID card, staring at it like it couldn't possibly be real. His face drained of color, and for the first time, the all-powerful judge looked powerless. You're a federal prosecutor? He stammered, his voice breaking the silence. Marcus nodded, his expression calm and unwavering. Yes, Your Honor, he said, his tone steady but firm. And part of my duty is to uphold the law and protect citizens from injustice, even when it happens in a courtroom. The words cut through the room like thunder. People sat frozen, realizing they were witnessing something extraordinary. The balance of power had shifted. The judge who for years had ruled with arrogance, dismissing evidence and intimidating defendants, had just been humbled by the very man he thought he could silence. For a long moment, Judge Owens didn't speak. His lips parted, but no words came out. He set the ID back down with shaking hands, glancing nervously at the faces staring at him from the benches. Every eye in the courtroom was on him, waiting, judging. Marcus continued, his voice calm but commanding. When I walked into this room today, I expected the same fairness every citizen deserves. I presented evidence that proved my innocence, yet you refused to even look at it. Instead, you mocked me, dismissed me, and declared me guilty before I had the chance to be heard. The judge shifted uncomfortably, his robe suddenly feeling heavier than ever. Marcus leaned forward slightly, his tone growing firmer. If this is how you treat me, a federal prosecutor, then I can only imagine how many ordinary citizens you've treated the same way. People who didn't have the power, the position, or the resources to fight back. People who trusted this courtroom to give them fairness and instead were silenced. A murmur of agreement swept through the crowd. Some nodded. Some whispered, "He's right." The truth was undeniable. The judge tried to recover, his voice shaky. "Well, I didn't realize who you were." If I had known, Marcus cut him off, his tone sharp but controlled. And that, Your Honor, is the problem. Justice should not depend on who a person is. It should not matter what title they hold, how they dress, or the color of their skin. Justice should be blind. But today in this courtroom, justice was not blind. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. Judge Owens sank back in his chair, his authority shattered. For the first time in years, he wasn't the one in control. Marcus calmly picked up his ID and slipped it back into his folder. He straightened his suit and looked around the courtroom. Every pair of eyes was on him, filled with admiration, respect, and relief. They knew what he had done was bigger than just fighting a traffic ticket. He had exposed the truth that even those in power could be held accountable. As Marcus turned and walked toward the door, the whispers grew louder. "He's a prosecutor." He stood up to the judge. "Did you hear what he said?" The people in the benches would never forget what they had witnessed. Judge Owens sat frozen at his bench, staring down at his desk. His smugness was gone, his confidence destroyed. He knew this incident would not disappear quietly. There would be questions, investigations, maybe even consequences for his actions. And all it had taken was one man's courage to stand up, refuse to be silenced, and demand fairness. Marcus walked out of that courthouse with his head held high. He wasn't just victorious in his own case, he had given everyone in that room a reminder of what true justice really means. Because justice is not about arrogance, it is not about power. It is not about appearances. Justice is about truth, fairness, and equality. And on that day in that courtroom, one federal prosecutor made sure that lesson was heard loud and clear. For a moment, Judge Owens tried to recover. His voice cracked as he stammered, "Well, I didn't realize." His confident tone was gone, replaced with hesitation. The man who usually controlled every inch of his courtroom now looked exposed and vulnerable. But Marcus wasn't letting him off so easily. His expression remained calm, but his words carried power. "The problem, Your Honor," he said firmly, "is that justice should never depend on who a person is, what they look like, or what position they hold. Every person in this courtroom deserves fairness. Yet today you dismissed my evidence without review. You insulted me in front of everyone, and you attempted to fine an innocent man." The words echoed in the silent room. People began to nod, their eyes fixed on Marcus. Some even clapped quietly before catching themselves, unsure if it was appropriate in a courtroom. But the message was clear, the truth was undeniable, and Marcus had spoken it fearlessly. Judge Owens shifted in his chair, his face pale. For years, he had ruled this room like a king, his word taken as final, his arrogance rarely questioned. But now, standing before a federal prosecutor, he felt the walls closing in. His reputation, his authority, even his career, everything suddenly felt fragile. He opened his mouth again, but nothing came out. His throat was dry. The words he usually wielded with such force now betrayed him. All he could do was swallow hard. His eyes darting nervously between Marcus and the people watching from the benches, Marcus took a step closer, his presence commanding but not aggressive. His voice was calm, measured, but firm enough to carry to the farthest corner of the courtroom. "I want you to understand something clearly, Your Honor. Today it was me, but tomorrow it could be anyone. A hardworking parent trying to defend themselves, a young man wrongly accused, an elderly citizen who doesn't have the means to fight back. They all come into this room hoping for fairness. And if you treat them the way you treated me, then you are failing them. You are failing the very system you swore to uphold." Murmurs filled the benches. People exchanged looks of agreement, some nodding more openly now. The tension in the room had shifted completely. The judge, who once sat so high and untouchable, now looked smaller than ever. Judge Owens leaned forward, his hands gripping the edge of his desk. His lips trembled, but he couldn't form a proper defense. The weight of his own actions hung over him like a heavy shadow. Marcus didn't stop there. He looked the judge directly in the eye, his voice steady and unwavering. "I will be filing an official report on this incident. Not just for myself, but for every person who may have faced the same bias in your courtroom. This is not about my fine. This is about accountability. No one is above the law, not even a judge." Gasps spread through the room again. Everyone knew the impact of those words. A federal prosecutor filing an official report could mean hearings, investigations, even the removal of the judge. The judge slumped back in his chair. His shoulders sagged, his once firm posture now broken. For the first time, the gavel in his hand felt useless. He had ruled countless cases with authority, silencing defendants, mocking them, brushing aside their pleas. But now he was the one silenced. He tried to speak, but no words came. His mouth opened, then closed again. All he managed was a faint whisper, I understand." Marcus gathered his documents, calm as ever. He didn't need to shout or threaten. His truth, his courage, and his position carried more weight than any gavel could. He placed his folder under his arm, glanced once more at the people in the benches, and nodded respectfully. The crowd responded with a quiet energy, admiration shining in their eyes. They knew they had witnessed something extraordinary, someone standing up to the very power that had so often looked down on them. Marcus turned back to the judge one last time. His voice was steady, his words final. "Justice is not about pride, Your Honor. It is about fairness. And today you forgot that? I won't let it be forgotten." With that, he walked toward the courtroom doors. The sound of his footsteps echoed in the silence. Every eye followed him as he left, the heavy doors closing behind him with a firm thud. The room stayed quiet for several moments after. Judge Owens remained slumped in his chair, staring down at the bench. His confident smirk was gone, his authority shattered. For once, he had nothing to say, and the people in the benches? They would never forget the day they saw a federal prosecutor humble a judge. It wasn't just about one man fighting a traffic fine. It was about exposing prejudice, demanding accountability, and reminding everyone what justice is truly meant to be, because in that moment, Marcus had proven something powerful. No matter how high the seat, no one is beyond the reach of truth that day. Marcus walked out of the courthouse not as a defeated defendant, but as a symbol of courage and justice. The heavy wooden doors closed behind him, but inside, the echoes of his words still lingered. People whispered among themselves, their eyes wide with disbelief and admiration. For years, Judge Owens had treated people with arrogance and bias, but no one had ever stood up to him the way Marcus had. By the end of the day, the story was everywhere. It started as murmurs in the courthouse halls, then spilled into coffee shops, grocery stores, and street corners. People who had sat quietly under Judge Owens' rulings now found the courage to share their own experiences. Mothers remembered being dismissed when they tried to defend themselves. Young men spoke about being humiliated in front of a full courtroom. Elderly citizens recalled being fined unfairly without a chance to explain. For years, Owens had hidden behind his robe and gavel. But Marcus's confrontation ripped that shield away. The local newspaper quickly picked up the story. Federal prosecutor confronts judge over bias. Soon, it was on radio stations, community blogs, and even regional news channels. Everywhere, people were talking about it. Marcus hadn't just defended himself, he had spoken for an entire community that had been silenced too many times. Within weeks, word reached the higher courts. Complaints against Judge Owens that had been brushed aside before were suddenly taken seriously. An official investigation began into his conduct. Investigators reviewed past cases, looking at patterns of fines, dismissals, and rulings. What they found was alarming: repeated acts of prejudice, an undeniable history of abuse of power, and countless moments where justice had been twisted to serve his ego. The more they uncovered, the worse it looked for Judge Owens. Former defendants came forward, willing to testify about their treatment. Court staff admitted they had witnessed unfair rulings but felt powerless to speak. Piece by piece, the image of a strict but fair judge crumbled, revealing the truth of a man who had been corrupt for years. And then, the day came when the ruling was official. Judge Richard Owens was removed from the bench. The same courthouse where he once ruled with arrogance now whispered with relief. His name would forever be remembered, not for authority, but for disgrace. When the news broke, the town felt a wave of change. People who had long doubted the system felt hope again. They saw that even those in power could be held accountable. For many, it was the first time they believed justice could truly belong to everyone, not just the privileged. As for Marcus, he did not celebrate loudly. That was not his way. He continued his work as a federal prosecutor, handling cases with the same calm determination that had carried him through that unforgettable day. But something inside him had deepened. He was more determined than ever to fight for fairness, not just in big, headline-grabbing cases, but in the everyday injustices that ordinary people faced. In interviews, Marcus spoke humbly about what happened. "It wasn't about me," he told one reporter. "It was about what's right. A courtroom should be the one place where truth is heard and justice is equal. If people can't trust that, then the system fails." I couldn't let that happen. His words resonated far beyond the town. Young law students looked to him as an example of integrity. Communities battling prejudice saw his story as a symbol of hope. Parents told their children about the man who stood up against injustice and won, not with anger, but with courage and truth. Even years later, people still remembered that moment. They recalled the silence in the courtroom when Marcus revealed who he was. They remembered the shock on Judge Owens' face, the gasps from the crowd, the quiet clapping that broke out despite the tension. It became a story told again and again, proof that one voice, when spoken with courage, could bring down years of arrogance and abuse. And through it all, Marcus remained grounded. To him, the fight was never about pride or revenge. It was about protecting the dignity of every person who walked into a courtroom, no matter their color, status, or background. His story became a reminder etched into the community's memory. Justice should never depend on skin color, status, or appearance. True justice treats everyone equally, and thanks to Marcus's courage, one corrupt judge learned that lesson the hard way. If this story shocked you, hit that subscribe button because even bigger stories are coming your way.